The first time, Matilda Ramsey heard the sound of an axe splitting wood before the sun had even considered rising. She pressed her ear against the rough-hewn wall of her little homestead cabin and told herself she was imagining things. It was the autumn of 1874, and the high plains of eastern Colorado had a way of playing tricks on a woman who had been living alone for 7 months. The wind came down off the Rockies like something with a grudge, and it howled through the gaps in the cabin walls she had patched 3 times already with mud and straw and sheer stubbornness. Sounds traveled strange out here. She had learned that much. A coyote could sound like a crying child. A loose shutter could sound like a man knocking, and apparently in the gray dark before dawn, the wind could sound very much like someone splitting firewood. She went back to bed and told herself to sleep. But when she rose with the pale light of morning and stepped outside to draw water from the well, she stopped dead at the sight of the woodpile beside her cabin. It had nearly tripled overnight. Neat, clean splits of pine and cottonwood were stacked chest-high against the east wall, and the smell of fresh-cut wood hung in the cold October air like something sacred. Matilda set down her water bucket and stood very still for a long moment. She was 26 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that had gone rough from work she had never expected to be doing alone. Her husband, Robert Ramsey, had died the previous March, 3 weeks after they had arrived in Colorado Territory from Missouri with a wagon full of hope and a deed to 160 acres under the Homestead Act. A fever had taken him fast and merciless, and Matilda had buried him under the single cottonwood tree on the eastern edge of their land, and then stood there in the mud with nowhere to go and nothing to do but stay. Going back to Missouri meant defeat, and it meant her brother-in-law's house, and it meant a life of being a burden to people who would smile through their teeth while they resented her. Staying in Colorado meant the homestead, the land Robert had believed in, the future they had crossed 3 states to build. She had chosen to stay. She had not entirely understood at the time what that would cost her. It cost her everything she had not known she possessed, strength she had not known lived in her shoulders. A stubbornness she had not known was in her bones. A capacity for loneliness that she had measured out carefully, like flour, because there was only so much of it she could afford to feel at once. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles east. That was Jedediah Underwood. She had met him twice. The first time, 2 weeks after she had buried Robert, when he had ridden over on a big gray horse to introduce himself and offer condolences in a voice so quiet and careful she had the feeling he had practiced the words on the ride over. He was 30 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the particular color of a November sky, not quite gray and not quite blue. He had taken off his hat and held it in both hands and told her that if she ever needed anything, his place was 3 miles east and he would come. She had thanked him with the formal politeness of a woman who had no intention of ever calling on him for anything. The second time she had seen him was at the general store in the town of Cutter's Creek, 8 miles south, where she had gone in late August to buy salt and lamp oil and flour. He had been there buying horse feed and nails, and he had nodded to her across the store with the same careful, unhurried respect he had shown at her door, and she had nodded back, and that had been the sum of it. Now she stood looking at a woodpile that had not been there the day before, and she knew, with a certainty she could not argue with, that there was only one person in 3 miles who would have done this without being asked. Matilda felt something complicated move through her. Gratitude, yes. She needed the wood desperately. Winter was 6 weeks away at best, and she had nowhere near enough split and stacked. But alongside the gratitude was something else, something she recognized as the particular pride of a woman who had survived 7 months alone, and was not entirely sure she wanted anyone to know how close to the edge of not surviving she had been. And beneath all of that was something she did not examine very closely. Something that had to do with the fact that a man had risen before the sun to do something for her, and had not knocked on her door to tell her about it, had not asked for acknowledgement or thanks, had simply done it and left. She picked up her water bucket. She drew her water. She went inside and made her breakfast and thought about it all morning. The following Sunday, she drove her wagon the 8 miles to Cutter's Creek for church services in the little clapboard building that served as both a house of worship and a town meeting hall. Jedediah Underwood was there, sitting 3 rows behind her and 1 pew to the left, and when services let out and people gathered in the thin autumn sunshine to talk, she made her way through the small crowd and stopped in front of him. He saw her coming and his whole posture changed in some subtle way, like a man who was not sure whether he was about to be thanked or reprimanded and was preparing himself for either. "Mr. Underwood," she said. "Mrs. Ramsey," he said, and she noticed he had shaved and his hair was still too long but looked like someone had made an effort with a comb. "I wonder if you might know something about the woodpile that appeared beside my cabin this week," she said, and kept her voice completely level. He looked at her steadily. His jaw moved slightly. "I might know something about that," he said. "I thought perhaps you might," she said. "I wanted to thank you." He nodded once. "Winter comes hard up here," he said. "Saw you were short when I rode past the other week." "You rode past my cabin," she said. "On my way to Cutter's Creek," he said. "I do sometimes." She looked at him for a moment and thought about that. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were paying very close attention, she noticed. "Well," she said, "thank you." "It was nothing," he said, and something about the quiet simplicity of those 3 words made her feel unexpectedly like she might cry. She pressed that feeling down firmly and said, "All the same," and then someone called Jedediah's name from across the churchyard and the moment ended. She drove home thinking that she had been wrong. It had not been nothing. It had been something. She was just not yet ready to understand what. October deepened and the cold came down off the mountains in earnest. Matilda worked from first light to last, mending fence lines that the summer had loosened, laying in the last of her root vegetables, patching the cabin walls a 4th time with a mixture of clay she had found along the creek bed mixed with dried grass. She had 4 chickens and a milk cow named Beulah, and a mule called Perdition, who was exactly as difficult as his name suggested, and she tended them all with the focused, relentless care of a woman who understood that her survival rested on theirs. She did not see Jedediah Underwood for 2 weeks, but on a Tuesday morning when she went out to begin her day, there was more wood. Not a great pile this time, but a modest addition to the stack, precisely fitted in with what was already there, as if someone had assessed the existing pile and calculated exactly what was needed to bring it up to a certain standard. She stood looking at it with her hands on her hips and the cold morning air turning her breath to mist, and she thought, with a feeling she could not entirely name, that whoever had done this had been watching more carefully than she had realized. She thought about obligation. She thought about the unwritten codes of the frontier, where neighbors helped neighbors because survival sometimes depended on it, and because there was a kind of practical community to life out here that had nothing to do with sentiment. She thought about how a man 3 miles away might feel a neighborly responsibility to a widow woman on a claim she was working alone. She told herself that was all this was, obligation, the done thing, the decent thing maybe, but no more than that. She told herself that several times. The 3rd time the wood appeared, it was a Thursday in early November, and she had been lying awake at 3 in the morning listening to the wind when she heard it. The sound she had dismissed as imagination back in October, the steady, rhythmic sound of an axe hitting wood, sharp and clean through the cold air. She got up. She wrapped herself in her heavy wool shawl and pushed her feet into her boots without lacing them, and she went to the window and looked out. The moon was 3/4 full, and the sky was so clear and cold it seemed to ring like glass, and in the pale silver light she could see him. He was in the open ground beside the cabin, 30 feet from where she stood, and he was working with an economy and power that came from long habit. He had a rhythm to it, the log set on the chopping block, the axe raised in a clean arc, the split that opened the wood like something it had always wanted to be, then the pieces stacked, and the next log lifted, and the arc again. He had been out there before the sun. She did not know when he had started, but from the size of the addition to the pile, he had been at it for a long time. Matilda stood at the window for a long time without moving. Something was happening inside her chest that she could not organize into anything as simple as gratitude or obligation. It was more than that. It was the sight of someone working in the cold dark for no reason she could see except that she needed it. Not asking for thanks, not making sure she saw him, just doing it. She went back to bed. She lay on her back with her eyes open, and she thought that she was going to have to do something about this. Not to stop it, because the winter was settling in hard and she needed the wood, and she was not too proud to need it, but because this could not continue on the terms she had been assigning to it. These were not the terms of an obliging neighbor. A man did not rise before the sun for obligation. The next Sunday she was at church again, and so was he, and when services ended she did not wait for the crowd but went directly to him and said, without preamble, "I would like to invite you to supper, Mr. Underwood, Thursday evening if that suits." He looked at her with those November sky eyes and said, "It suits." 6 o'clock, she said. "I'll be there," he said. She spent more of Thursday than she was willing to admit preparing for that supper. She made a venison stew with the dried herbs she had saved from summer, and cornbread from the last of her good cornmeal, and she set her small table with the 2 china plates that had survived the journey from Missouri without breaking, the ones with the blue flower pattern that had belonged to her mother. She braided her hair more carefully than usual and changed into her second-best dress, the brown wool one that was less faded than the first. When he knocked at 6 o'clock, she opened the door and saw that he had made his own preparations. He had shaved again and combed his hair and was wearing a clean shirt under his heavy coat, and he was holding a jar of apple preserves that must have come from his own stores. "Mrs. Ramsey," he said. "Mr. Underwood," she said. "Come in." He came in and took off his hat and stood in her small cabin with the low fire burning and the smell of the stew, and he looked at home there in a way she had not expected. Not intrusively at home, but quietly, as if a space had been waiting for him without anyone knowing. He handed her the apple preserves and said, "I put these up in September. They turned out better than last year." She set the jar on the table. "Do you do much canning?" she asked. "I do what's necessary," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not boastful, just honest, the tone of a man who had learned to do a great many things alone. They sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes there was the pleasant, filling silence of 2 people occupied with food and warmth after cold work. Then she asked him about his homestead, and he told her. He had been there 4 years, had come from Tennessee after the war had taken too much of what Tennessee used to be, had built his cabin himself and added to it twice, had a small herd of cattle and a kitchen garden, and an apple orchard of 12 trees he had planted from saplings 3 years ago and was still waiting to see bear fruit. "You fought in the war," she said, and the question was careful because everyone who had fought carried it differently and you could not always know which way. "I did," he said. Union sighed, his voice was even. "I don't talk about it much." "You don't have to," she said. He looked at her across the table and something shifted in his expression. "You're easy to talk to," he said, "or easy not to talk to, which is rarer." She felt warmth in her face and was glad of the firelight. "My mother used to say that silence was a conversation too," she said. "Your mother was wise," he said. They talked through the rest of the meal and well past it, the coffee cups going cold and the fire burning lower, talking about Missouri and Tennessee, and the particular madness and beauty of Colorado territory, about the land they both worked and the weather that ruled them, and the small daily business of homestead life. She told him about Robert, not a great deal but enough, and he listened the way he seemed to do everything, with complete attention and no urge to fill the space with sound. When she was done he said, he chose good land, and she knew that was his way of saying something larger. When the fire had burned to coals and the hour was late she stood and said, "You have a long ride home." He stood too and reached for his hat. "I don't mind the ride," he said. Then he paused with his hat in his hands and said, with the same quiet deliberateness she was coming to recognize as his particular manner. "I'd like to come again, if you'd permit it." She looked at him. "I'd permit it," she said. Nodded, put on his hat, and went to the door. Then he turned back and said, "Mrs. Ramsey, about the wood." She had been waiting for this. "Yes. I don't want you to think it's something I feel obligated to do," he said, "because it isn't." She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire had gone to embers, and the only light was the cold moonlight coming through the window and the last faint orange glow from the hearth, and in that uncertain light his face was serious and earnest and entirely unguarded. "What is it, then?" she asked, and her voice came out quieter than she had intended. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll let you think on that." And then he was gone, his boots on the frozen ground outside, the creak of his saddle, the sound of the big gray horse moving away into the dark. Matilda stood in the middle of her small cabin with her hands loose at her sides and thought that she was in very serious trouble. November settled in around them like something permanent. The first real snow came on a Saturday, and it was not the gentle preliminary snowfall that the East sometimes sent first. It was a hard, driving snowstorm that came down out of the north and closed the world down to 20 feet in any direction. Matilda spent 2 days feeding animals and moving snow and keeping the fire built up, and when the storm broke and the sky turned blue and crystalline, and the snow lay 3 feet deep across the plain, she found herself thinking about Jedediah Underwood with a frequency that could not be explained away as simple, neighborly concern. He came back the following Thursday, as he had said he would, and the Thursday after that. It became a pattern without either of them naming it as such, a pattern with the particular quality of something both deliberate and inevitable, like water finding its course. He would arrive at 6 with his hat in his hands and something contributed toward the meal, once dried beans, once a dressed rabbit, once a small paper parcel of cinnamon from the general store in Cutter's Creek, and they would eat and talk, and the hours would expand past what either of them had planned. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but feature by feature as you move through it. She learned that he read whenever he could get books, which was not often, and that he had a copy of Shakespeare's complete works that had come with him from Tennessee in a trunk, and was the only thing he would not leave behind if the cabin caught fire. She learned that he had a younger sister in Memphis who wrote him letters 3 times a year, and to whom he wrote back with a care and affection that surprised her each time she glimpsed it. She learned that he could not carry a tune at all but knew the words to an enormous number of hymns and songs, which he sometimes proved by reciting them, which made her laugh. He learned things about her too. She let him, which was itself something she noted. She had not thought of herself as a guarded person, but 7 months alone had built walls she had not noticed, until someone was standing near them. With Jedediah she found herself speaking before she had thought about whether to speak, saying things she had not intended to say, laughing at things she had not expected to find funny. One Thursday in late November she caught herself watching him across the table while he talked about something. She could not have said what because she had stopped hearing the words and was just watching his face, the way the lamplight moved in his eyes, the slight smile that he reserved for moments when he was genuinely amused, not a wide smile but something quiet and bright at once. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she was falling in love with this man. She put the thought away immediately. She looked down at her coffee cup and made herself attend to what he was saying. But the thought did not stay put. It sat in the corner of her mind and looked at her with the patient certainty of something that knew it had all the time it needed. The wood continued. She could not stop noticing it. She had not exactly tested to see what would happen if she did not mention it, because she had taken up the habit of not mentioning it, of simply noting it with a private gratitude that felt different from the complicated mix of feelings it had produced at first. She noticed it with something close to tenderness now, which told her more about her own heart than she was entirely comfortable knowing. The morning she found the wood split and stacked after the biggest overnight snowfall yet, when the temperature had dropped to what she estimated was somewhere well below zero, and the ground was iron hard, and the stars were still out. She sat at her table with her coffee and she thought, "This man has been chopping wood for me since before the sun came up in the coldest darkness of the year, and he has not asked me once if I wanted him to." She thought about what she was going to do about that. December arrived, and with it, a particular kind of quiet beauty that Matilda had not expected from Colorado. The way the snow held light even at dusk. The way the mountains to the west turned colors she had no names for at sunrise. The way the world simplified itself down to the things that mattered most when everything else was put away under white. On the first Sunday of December, she saw Jedediah in town, and he mentioned, in the same unhurried way he mentioned everything, that his neighbor on the south side, old Wallace Kern, had taken sick with a lung complaint and could not get his cattle through the winter without help, and that he had been riding over to Wallace's place in the mornings to do what he could. She listened and thought, that is why he comes to my place before the sun. He does Wallace's animals in the dark before light, and then comes to do my wood before he goes back to his own cattle. She went to him after services when most people had already started for their wagons and the churchyard was half empty, and she said, "Jedediah." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both knew it. He stopped and looked at her with that careful attention. "You're helping Wallace Kern in the mornings," she said. "I am," he said, "and before you go to Wallace's you're at my place splitting wood." He did not look away. "Yes," he said. "When do you sleep?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved. "I sleep fine," he said. "That is not an answer to my question," she said. He was quiet for a moment, his hat in his hands, the December wind moving his hair. Then he said, "Matilda," and her name in his mouth was something she had not been prepared for, the way he said it, like it was the right word for the right thing at exactly the right moment. "I don't want you to go cold this winter. That's the entire truth of it." She looked at him and thought about the entire truth of it, and decided that the entire truth of it included a great deal more than firewood, and that he knew that and she knew that, and neither of them was quite ready to say so out loud. So she said, "Come to supper Friday instead of Thursday. I'm making a roast." "I'll be there," he said. She went home and let herself feel it. Let the thing she had been putting away in the corner come out and sit in the middle of the room and look at her. She was in love with Jedediah Underwood. She had been a widow for 9 months, and she was in love with a man who rose before the sun to bring her firewood and did not tell her about it, and it was the most alive she had felt since before Robert had gotten sick. She thought about Robert. She thought about him honestly, the way she had trained herself to do, not with the bright, painful varnish of grief, but with the clearer sight that time had given her. She had loved Robert. He had been a good man, kind and earnest and full of plans, and his death had been a terrible, unfair thing. But she was 26 years old and she was alive, and the plain, honest truth was that what she had felt for Robert and what she was beginning to feel for Jedediah Underwood were two different things in a way that she could not have explained but understood completely. Friday came and she made the roast with dried wild onions and the last of her summer carrots, and when Jedediah arrived at 6, he brought a bottle of apple brandy he had been apparently saving since September, and she poured 2 small glasses, and they drank them by the fire before supper and talked about nothing and everything. And she was so aware of him, of the particular quality of his presence, the stillness of him, the way he took up exactly the right amount of space and no more. After supper, while she was washing the plates in the basin, he stood up from the table and came to stand beside her to dry them, picking up the cloth from the nail by the window as if he had been doing it for years. They stood side by side in comfortable silence, and the lamplight threw their shadows together on the wall, and she thought that this, right here, was a kind of happiness she had not anticipated and could not exactly name. "Jedediah," she said, not looking up from the plate in her hands. "Yes," he said. "I know it is an obligation," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. She looked up from the plate and found him looking at her, and his face had the expression she had come to recognize as what he looked like when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. He set down the plate he had been drying. He turned toward her. He was close, not improperly close, but close enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the small scar above his left eyebrow she had never quite asked about, and the way his eyes moved when he was thinking. "No," he said. "It's not obligation." "Then what is it?" she asked, and it was the same question she had asked on that first night, nearly 2 months ago, and they both remembered it. "I think you know what it is," he said quietly. "I think I do," she said, "but I'd like to hear it." He reached out and took the plate from her hands and set it on the counter, and then he just looked at her for a moment with those eyes that held more than most people said in a year, and he said, "Matilda, I have been in love with you since the first time I rode up to your door, and you looked at me like you were perfectly capable of managing without me, and were only entertaining my condolences because it would have been rude not to." She felt her breath catch somewhere in her chest. "That was grief," she said. "I was not myself." "I know," he said. "That's part of what made me want to come back." She searched his face and found nothing in it but honesty, the pure stripped-back honesty of a man who had apparently decided the time for being careful about this was over. "I have tried," she said carefully, "very hard not to feel what I feel." "Did it work?" he asked. "No," she said. He took her hand. He held it in both of his the way he had held his hat when he stood at her door in March, with the same careful deliberateness. And she thought of that moment, and of every moment since, and of all the early mornings and the cold dark, and the sound of an axe, and a man who had never once asked for anything back. "I'm not asking you to rush into anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I wanted you to know what it is." "I know what it is," she said. "On my end, too." Something in his face shifted, a relaxing of something he had been holding tightly, a warmth that moved up from somewhere and changed the whole landscape of his expression. He was still holding her hand, and she turned her hand over in his and held his instead. "I'm not the same person I was in March," she said. "I don't know if that's a good thing or a complicated thing." "It's a true thing," he said. "Those are usually the best kind." She looked at him and thought about all the Thursdays and Fridays and early mornings, about the wood and the apple preserves and the dried rabbit and the Shakespeare, about the silence that felt like more than silence, about the way he dried her dishes and sat in her chair and listened to her talk about her dead husband without flinching and without jealousy, about how thoroughly and quietly he had become part of her world. "Stay a while longer," she said. "The fire doesn't need to be let down yet." He smiled fully, the way she did not often see, and which was something entirely worth waiting for. "I'll stay," he said. Christmas was 10 days away, and Cutter's Creek was doing its modest best to celebrate. The general store had put pine boughs in the window, and the saloon had a wreath on the door. And on the Sunday before Christmas, the little church was crowded with every family within 15 miles. And the minister, a cheerful stout man named Reverend Holt, gave a sermon about gratitude that Matilda listened to with her hands folded and her mind partially elsewhere. Afterward, in the churchyard, she talked to some of the other women from neighboring homesteads. There was Clara Bridger, who was 32 and sharp-tongued and funny, and one of the people Matilda liked best in Cutter's Creek, and Clara's husband Tom, who was always red-faced and good-natured, and the Delacroix family who had come up from New Mexico the previous year and whose eldest daughter, 16-year-old Adeline, had taken to following Matilda around with the transparent admiration of a girl who approved of a woman doing things on her own. Clara pulled Matilda aside with the particular efficiency of a woman who has something to say and is going to say it. "I see Jedediah Underwood looking at you," Clara said. "Is that so?" said Matilda. "Has been for months," Clara said. "Does he talk to you?" "He comes to supper on Fridays," Matilda said, and kept her voice even. Clara looked at her for a long, silent moment. "Matilda Ramsey," she said. "What? Are you going to make that man declare himself, or are you going to let him keep chopping wood for you indefinitely?" Matilda laughed before she could stop herself. What do you know about the wood? My Tom rides past your place every 2 weeks to check the creek level, Clara said. He has mentioned the wood situation to me on 3 separate occasions, with a look on his face that was very close to romantic. Tom Bridger is romantic about Firewood. Tom Bridger is romantic about a man who does more than he says and says more than most people think, Clara said, and her voice was fond. Matilda looked across the churchyard to where Jedediah was talking to Reverend Holt and Wallace Kern, who had recovered enough to attend services but still looked thin and pale, and she thought about what Clara had said. "He has declared himself," she said quietly. Clara's expression went from sharp to warm in an instant. And I have not discouraged it," Matilda said. Clara squeezed her arm. "Good," she said simply. On Christmas Eve, Jedediah came to her door not at 6, but at 4 in the afternoon, and he had something under his arm wrapped in brown paper and string, and he had clearly tried harder than usual with the combing of his hair, which had finally been cut and now sat at an appropriate length. She opened the door and he said, "Merry Christmas," and his voice had a warmth in it that was different from his usual careful quiet. She stepped back and let him in and took his coat and hat, and they sat by the fire, and she poured cider she had been warming on the hearth, and she gave him the gift she had made, a pair of heavy wool gloves she had knitted from yarn she had been carefully unraveling from an old sweater of Robert's that no longer needed to be kept as a memorial. She had decided that a practical new use was the most respectful thing you could do with something that had belonged to a practical man. He took the gloves with a seriousness that meant he understood the weight of them. He turned them over in his hands and looked at her and said, "These are something." "They're warm," she said. "You need them. You spend a great deal of time outside before sunrise." His eyes held hers. "I do," he said simply. He gave her the parcel from under his arm and she undid the paper carefully and found inside a book. She looked at the cover. It was a copy of Charlotte Brant's Jane Eyre, and it was not new. She could see it had been read, but it was in good condition, and when she opened it she saw written on the inside cover in Jedediah's careful handwriting, "For Mr. because she has as much spine as Jane does and considerable more practical skill." Ju. She read this twice. She pressed her lips together against a smile. "Practical skill," she said. "It's a compliment," he said seriously. "Jane Eyre is not known for her practical skills. She is known for her spirit," Matilda said. "Yes," he said. "You have that too, but you can also mend a fence." She laughed, and it came from somewhere deep and easy, and she thought she had not laughed like this in a year, the entirely unguarded kind. He was watching her with that expression she had learned to read, the quiet brightness, and she thought, quite deliberately this time and without putting it away, that she loved him. "Jedediah," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I have been working up to saying it for a while, and I thought Christmas Eve was a reasonable occasion." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Matilda," and stopped. "You don't need to say it back right this moment if you need time," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I don't need time," he said. "I have been in love with you since March, and I told you so, and I have been saying it in whatever other way I could think of since then because I did not want to crowd you." He paused. "I love you. I should have said those specific words sooner." The fire popped in the hearth. The cold wind moved past outside, harmless tonight, because she was warm inside, and she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire or even the wood stacked high against the east wall of her cabin. She moved from her chair to the settee where he was sitting, and she took his hand, which was warm even without the new gloves, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together while the fire burned, and the Christmas Eve darkness came down over the Colorado plain. They were not young people making a first venture into love. They were people who had both lost things, he the war and the Tennessee he had known, she a husband and a life she had planned for. They were people who had both learned to manage alone and had not been looking for someone to need, which was possibly why this had taken the shape it had. Not a sudden passionate claiming, but a slow, careful building, like a man stacking wood in the dark before the sun came up, piece by piece, until there was enough to last. Winter deepened through January of 1875, and the world outside Matilda's cabin was a white silence broken only by the cattle sounds and the wind, and on certain mornings, the sound she had long since stopped pretending not to listen for. On a Wednesday morning in the second week of January, she woke at 4 to the sound of the axe, and she did not go back to sleep. She built up the fire and put the coffee on, and when she heard his boots on the step, she opened the door before he could knock. He stood there in the pre-dawn dark with his axe over his shoulder and frost in his hair and his breath a cloud around him, and he blinked at the open door and the light and the smell of coffee and then at her, and she thought she would remember this specific moment, his face, for the rest of her life. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came in. He set the axe by the door and took off his coat and hat, and she handed him a cup and he wrapped both hands around it, and she sat across from him at the table and they talked in the low, quiet way of people who do not need to fill silence but choose to speak because they want to. "You don't have to come so early," she said. "I know," he said. "I have plenty of wood," she said. "You'll need more before March," he said. "February is going to be hard. You can tell that." "The way the sky looked last night," he said. "My father could tell weather by the sky. I learned some of it from him." She watched him drink his coffee and said, "Your father, tell me about him." He told her. He talked about Tennessee in the way he rarely did, about the land his family had farmed there, and the particular blue of the Smoky Mountains in the morning, and a father who had been a quiet man with enormous hands who had taught him everything he knew about wood and weather and silence. He talked about losing the farm and losing his father and the war and eventually Colorado, which he had chosen because it was as far as you could get from what was gone without leaving the country entirely. "Do you miss it?" she said. "Tennessee," he thought about it. "I miss what it was," he said. "What it is now isn't what I miss." "Is Colorado what you wanted it to be?" she asked. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she felt the full weight of that look and knew he was not thinking only about the land. "It is now," he said. February came, and he had been right about the sky. 3 storms hit the high plains in the space of 20 days, and the third one was the worst weather Matilda had ever seen in her life. A blizzard that lasted 36 hours and piled snow up past the bottom of her windows, and killed 2 of her chickens despite everything she did to protect them. When it broke, she dug herself out through the drift against her front door and stood in the blinding white silence afterward and felt a bone-deep exhaustion that was partly physical and partly something else. She had not seen Jedediah in 10 days. The roads were impossible. She knew he was likely dealing with his own cattle and his own drifts and his own exhausted body, and she told herself this was fine and normal, and she was perfectly capable of managing for a few more days until the roads were passable. She was in the middle of telling herself this for the 3rd time on the morning after the blizzard broke, when she heard hoofbeats in the snow. She came outside to find him on the gray horse, blowing and steady, picking its way through the snow, and he swung down before the horse had fully stopped and covered the ground between them in 3 long strides. He put both hands on her face and looked at her with something in his eyes she had never seen in them before, something that was the opposite of his usual careful control. "Are you all right?" he said, and it was not quite a question. It was a statement looking for confirmation. "I'm all right," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady despite herself. He let out a breath. His hands on her face were cold through the gloves, the new wool gloves she had made him. "I couldn't get through for 3 days," he said. "After the last storm, the drift on the South Road was 6 feet. "I know," she said. "I'm all right, 2 chickens, but everything else." He looked at her for one more moment and then pulled her against him, and she went without arguing, which was its own answer to something. She stood in the bright cold morning with her arms around him and her face against his coat, and she thought, simply and completely, yes. He stayed the whole day. He helped her dig out the rest of the paths between the cabin and the barn and the woodpile, and he repaired the chicken coop door that the wind had torn off, and they ate supper together in the early dark of the winter evening and afterward sat by the fire, and she read aloud to him from Jane Eyre, which she had been reading since Christmas, and which he listened to with the still attention he gave to everything. When she reached a passage she particularly liked, She sometimes stopped and read it twice, and he did not rush her. When it was very late and he said he needed to get back to his cattle, she walked with him to the door, and he put on his coat and hat and then turned back and kissed her, for the first time, in the light of the dying fire. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for a long time and had something specific he wanted to say with it. She put her hand against his jaw and kissed him back with equal certainty, and when they separated he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, both of them breathing in the warm quiet of the cabin. "Come to supper Friday," she said. "Yes," he said, "and every Friday after that if you'll have me." "I'll have you," she said, "every Friday." He smiled that full smile and went out into the cold, and she stood at the door and watched the gray horse carry him away through the blue-white moonlit snow until she could not see him any more. March came in with a sharp, defiant cold that lasted 2 weeks and then broke suddenly, genuinely, into a warmth that smelled like possibility. The snow retreated from the south slopes first, and the creek ran high and musical with melt water, and the first green things began to push up along the banks with a determination that Matilda admired unreservedly. On the first warm Sunday in March, she and Jedediah walked the boundary of her property together after church, something they had talked about doing through the winter and had not been able to. He knew land the way he knew weather, by long observation and careful attention, and he pointed out things she had not noticed in the year she had been here. A second seep spring on the northwest corner that she had not known about, a stand of wild plum trees that would bloom in another 3 weeks and fruit in summer, a place along the eastern fence line where the creek had been slowly undermining the bank and would need attention before the high water of April. She walked beside him and listened and thought about what it meant to know land, to have learned it the way he had learned it, over years of daily attention. She thought about the 160 acres under the Homestead Act and about what those acres were and what they could be, and she thought about his land 3 miles east and his 12 apple trees waiting to bear fruit. "Jedediah," she said, as they stood on the eastern fence line with the creek moving fast and cold below them and the mountains white against the blue distance. "Yes," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it is not an impulsive question," she said. "I have been thinking about it for some time." He turned to face her with the full attention she was used to now and that she valued beyond most things she had ever valued about another person. "Marry me," she said. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough that she felt the beginning of a self-protective thought forming at the back of her mind, and then he said, "Yes." "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said again and stepped toward her and took her hands. "Matilda, yes, I was going to ask you." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to wait." He laughed the entirely unguarded laugh she had come to love, low and real and seldom. "No," he said, "you never do. Is that a complaint?" "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said, and then he kissed her in the March sunlight above the running creek, and she felt the cold of the air and the warmth of him and the solid ground of the homestead under her feet, and thought this was exactly the right place for this moment. Here on the land she had refused to leave. They were married on the first Saturday of April, 1875, in the little clapboard church in Cutter's Creek, with Reverend Holt officiating and Clara and Tom Bridger as witnesses and old Wallace Kern sitting in the front row looking so pleased with himself that you would have thought he had arranged the whole thing. The church was not full, but it was well attended, and the people there were the people of the territory, sun-weathered and straight-backed and genuinely glad, because a man and woman marrying in the spring after a hard winter was the most basic possible affirmation that life continued. Matilda wore her best dress, which was not very fine by Missouri standards but was clean and well-pressed, and the color of good coffee, and she had pressed a sprig of early wild plum blossom into her braided hair, white against brown, and when Jedediah saw her come in through the church door, he looked at her with an expression that required no translation whatsoever. He stood at the front of the church in the cleanest shirt she had ever seen him in and the only suit coat he owned, which fit him well in the shoulders and not quite perfectly in the sleeves but carried itself with a dignity that had more to do with him than with the coat. And when she reached him and they turned to face Reverend Holt, he took her hand with the same care he had taken it the first time, in front of her fire in December, and held it exactly the same way. They said their vows with the directness of two people who meant every word, and did not feel the need to ornament them. When Reverend Holt said, "You may kiss your bride," Jedediah kissed her with a tenderness that made Clara Bridger press her handkerchief to her eyes and Tom Bridger look at the ceiling and clear his throat significantly. Outside the church in the April sunshine, with the smell of new grass and mud and wild plum in the air, people came to shake their hands and offer their congratulations, and Matilda stood beside her husband, which was a word that sat differently in her mind than she had expected, warm and solid and right, and thought about what came next. What came next was the practical business of combining two homesteads, which was a question they had discussed at length over the winter and had decided, not simply but honestly, that they would live on Matilda's claim through the remaining 2 years of the 5-year Homestead Act period required to prove the land, and then decide what to do with it from a position of having earned it. Jedediah's land they would keep and work in rotation, the cattle grazing between both properties. It was not simple. The first months of marriage were full of the necessary collisions of two people who had each learned to do everything alone, suddenly having to negotiate the smallest domestic decisions. He stacked wood one way and she stacked it another, and they had a genuine argument about this one evening that ended with both of them laughing until they had to sit down, because they had realized they were treating the wood question with more seriousness than it warranted. They established an acceptable wood-stacking compromise. They moved forward. He was a quiet husband but an attentive one. She had known this from watching him, but it was different to experience it from the inside. The way he noticed things without comment, the way he anticipated needs she had not expressed, the way he could read her moods with an accuracy that was sometimes unnerving. She told him this and he said, quite seriously, that he had been paying attention to her since March of the previous year and had had a great deal of time to study. "That is slightly alarming," she said. "Probably," he agreed, "but accurate." She paid attention to him too. She had always paid attention to him, but now that they were together she found herself discovering things she had not been close enough to see before. He had nightmares sometimes, left over from the war, not often but occasionally, and on those nights he would lie very still and tightly controlled and she would put her hand on his chest and he would let out a breath and come back, and they never talked about it except in the morning when he would sometimes say simply, "Better in daylight," and she would say, "Always is," and that was enough. He moved the 12 apple saplings from his property to hers in late April, or rather to their property, and she helped him replant them along the south-facing slope where they would get the most sun, and they worked together in the spring dirt with the comfortable coordination of people who had learned to work beside each other, and she thought this was one of her favorite things, this quiet shared labor, this being useful in the same space. Summer brought the garden and the long golden days and the work of it, the fence repairs and the creek maintenance, and the cutting of hay for winter, the preserving of everything that could be preserved. Clara Bridger came over 3 days in late August to help with the canning, and they worked in the hot kitchen with the windows open and talked and laughed, and Clara told her all the news from Cutter's Creek with the cheerful ruthlessness of a born storyteller, and Matilda felt, sitting in her own kitchen with her hands in work and a friend at the table, something she recognized as happiness in its simplest and most complete form. Wallace Kern died in July. His lung complaint had never fully released him after the winter, and he went peacefully enough one morning before sunrise, which Jedediah heard about from a passing rider, and came to tell Matilda with his hat in his hands and his face quiet with a grief that was real. Wallace had no family in the territory, and Jedediah had become something like family to him over the course of the winter of helping. They went to the burial together, and Jedediah helped carry the coffin, and Matilda stood in the summer graveyard with the smell of dry grass, and the mountains bright above, and thought about the particular loneliness of the frontier, and how it could be mitigated but never entirely cured, and how important it was to do as Wallace and Jedediah had done for each other, to show up and be useful without waiting to be asked. Wallace's land reverted, as land without heirs tended to, and there was some discussion in town about who would claim it. Jedediah said he might put in for it in the fall to add to their cattle range, and Matilda said that sounded sensible. It was the first conversation they had in which the future felt truly large and open, full of land and possibility, and a horizon that kept moving forward as they moved toward it. In the fall, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the evening after supper, sitting across the table from him with her hands folded, and a calm on her face that she had assembled because she did not want him to see the nervousness underneath it, not fear exactly, but the particular vulnerability of sharing something enormous. He went very still. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "I am," she said. He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he stood up from his chair, came around the table and crouched down beside her so they were at the same level, and took both her hands. His face was the most open she had ever seen it, entirely unguarded, full of something that had no single name. "Matilda," he said. "You're not saying anything," she observed. "I don't have the words right now," he said, which was the most honest thing he could possibly have said, and she loved him for it. "That is all right," she said. "You'll think of them." He did. Over the following weeks, as autumn came down again for the second time since she had come to Colorado territory, he said all the words in pieces, over meals and in the evenings, and once in the middle of the night when she woke to find him awake beside her looking at the ceiling, and he said quietly, "I keep thinking about what I want for this child. Things I want to tell them, things I want to show them." "What things?" she asked. "Everything," he said. "The land, the mountains, how to read the sky. Where the plum trees are." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "You have time," she said. "I know," he said. I have never been someone's parent before. The idea is large." "I know," she said. "I find it large too." "Are you frightened?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "and also not, both at the same time." "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." They had their son in May of 1876, in the cabin on the homestead with a midwife named Mrs. Bauer from Cutter's Creek, who had delivered approximately 100 babies, and was brisk and competent, and told Jedediah 3 times to stop pacing, and once suggested he make himself useful by keeping the water hot. Advice he received with the obedient relief of a man glad to have something to do with his hands. The labor was long, and there was a period in the middle of it when Jedediah sat outside the cabin in the early morning dark with his elbows on his knees and his head down, listening to sounds inside he could not do anything about, and he felt a helplessness that was unlike anything he had ever felt, worse than the war, worse than winter, because it was something happening to someone he loved, and he could not chop it into manageable pieces and stack it. But then Mrs. Bauer opened the door and said, "Come in," and he went in, and Matilda was sitting up against the pillows, exhausted and radiant, and holding a very small, very red, completely furious child who had apparently announced his arrival to the household with great confidence. "He's loud," Jedediah said, and his voice was not steady. "He is," Matilda said, and she was smiling with her whole face in a way he had not seen before. "Come and see him." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time, and thought he had entirely underestimated the word large when he had used it to describe the idea of becoming a parent. The reality was not large. It was enormous. It was the size of the sky above the mountains, and then larger than that. "What do we call him?" Jedediah asked. "I was thinking," Matilda said, "that if you had no objection I would like to name him Thomas, after my father." "Thomas," Jedediah said, and looked at the small, red, furious face. "Thomas Underwood." "Do you mind?" she said. "I think it's a fine name," he said quietly. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the cabin the May morning was happening. The meadowlarks and the running creek and the young apple trees leafing out on the south slope, and the world was proceeding as it always did, indifferent and magnificent. Thomas Underwood was a bold, cheerful baby who very quickly became a bold, cheerful child. He had Jedediah's eyes and Matilda's stubborn chin, and a manner of engaging with the world that suggested he had never considered the possibility that it might not cooperate with him, which Jedediah found simultaneously familiar and alarming. The homestead prospered. The years moved through their seasons with the particular quality of years that are full of work and are, underneath the work, full of satisfaction. Jedediah did claim Wallace Kern's land as he had said he might, and it added to their cattle range considerably, and by the summer of 1877 they had a herd of 30 head and a genuine going operation, modest but solid and growing. Matilda's kitchen garden had become, over the summers, something that was spoken of admiringly by the women of Cutter's Creek, not just for its output but for its organization, the way she had terraced the south-facing slope and channeled the seep spring into a reliable irrigation system that kept things green even in the dry months of August. Clara Bridger came to look at it and then went home and redug her own garden beds according to Matilda's principles, and told Jedediah at the 4th of July celebration in town that his wife was the most practically intelligent person in the county, which Jedediah received with the satisfaction of a man who had always known this, but appreciated having it confirmed. The apple trees bore fruit in the late summer of 1877, the first real harvest from the 12 trees on the south slope. Matilda had been watching the fruit set for weeks with a particular excitement she could not entirely account for, and the morning they were ripe enough to pick, she went out at first light and bit into the first one she could reach, standing in the dew-wet grass under the small tree in the early sun, and it was tart and sweet and cold from the night, and she felt an uncomplicated delight that made her call for Jedediah, who came out of the cabin still putting on his shirt to find out what was happening, and found his wife standing under an apple tree, eating fruit with the joy of a person for whom a long-anticipated thing had come true. He ate one too, standing next to her in the early morning, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 3 years. He had planted them 3 years ago and carried them from his own land and replanted them here, and now they were bearing. Good things take time, she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him under the apple tree in the September morning, and thought about everything that had taken time, the seasons of the homestead, the careful building of something that had started with a man chopping wood before sunrise for a woman who had not asked him to, and had become this, the two of them and their son and their land and their life, solid and growing and entirely theirs. Thomas, who was 1.5 and had learned to walk with the committed enthusiasm of someone who had been kept from locomotion too long, arrived from the cabin at this moment in a way that suggested he had been placed on his feet and released without adequate consideration of direction, heading across the grass toward them with his arms out, and his face set with the determination of a man with a destination. Jedediah scooped him up without interrupting the thought, and Thomas grabbed a fistful of his father's shirt and looked at the apple tree with round-eyed interest. "Apple," Matilda said, and gave him a small piece. Thomas ate it with the focused appreciation of a child encountering something new and finding it acceptable. Then he pointed at the tree and said, very clearly, "More." "That's my son," Jedediah said. "He has your gift for saying exactly what he means," Matilda said, and laughed. The winter of 1877 coming on was different from the winter of 1874, from the winter she had faced alone with her 4 chickens and her mule and her patched cabin walls. The cabin had been extended twice by then. There was a real kitchen and a second room for Thomas. The gaps in the walls were properly chinking and not patched mud, and the woodpile that stood against the east wall was the most substantial it had ever been because Jedediah had started on it in late September, and had worked at it with the same steady morning habit that had first made her press her ear against the cabin wall 3 years ago and wonder if she was imagining things. He was not out there before the sun anymore, not regularly, because there was no longer any reason to be secretive about it, and he had a family to wake up with in the mornings. But on a Tuesday in October, when Thomas was sick with a cold and had kept them both up past midnight, and Matilda had finally gotten him settled back in his crib and had gone back to bed, she woke in the early gray to an empty space beside her and the familiar sound of an axe outside. She lay there for a moment and listened to it, the clean rhythmic sound of the wood being split, and she smiled in the dark and did not get up immediately. She just lay there and listened to the sound of him working, and thought about 3 years ago when she had stood at her window and watched a man she barely knew chopping wood in the cold before sunrise for no reason she could yet understand. She understood now. She had understood for a long time, but there was something about lying here in the warm bed with her son asleep in the next room, and the sound of her husband working outside, that she wanted to stay inside for a moment longer. This feeling of being known and tended to, and loved in the practical, daily, unsentimental way that she had learned, was the kind that lasted. She got up eventually and made the coffee, and when he came in with his coat cold and his face bright from the air, she handed him a cup without a word, and he took it and looked at her over the rim with that quiet brightness and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. By 1878, Cutter's Creek had grown enough to have a proper schoolhouse, which mattered to Matilda and Jedediah both, and to which they both contributed their labor in the building of, spending 2 October weekends with most of the other families of the county raising walls and setting the roof. Thomas, at 2, contributed to this project mainly by distributing nails to adults in the general direction of where they were needed, a job he took extremely seriously. The schoolhouse meant a teacher, who turned out to be a young man from Ohio named Mr. Carroll, who was 22 and earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the frontier, but deeply committed to the proposition that education was possible under any conditions. He boarded with the Bridgers that first year, and he and Tom Bridger argued about politics every evening after supper, according to Clara, with a cheerful mutual disrespect that both of them seemed to enjoy. Matilda had always been the most educated woman in the immediate vicinity of her homestead, which was not a distinction she wore ostentatiously, but which meant she was consulted about things, letters and documents and questions of reading and figuring, by neighbors who needed a hand. She began, in the winter of 1878, to teach a small informal reading class on Wednesday afternoons in her kitchen for 3 of the younger homestead wives who had not had much schooling. It was a modest thing, an hour a week around her kitchen table with the fire built up and Thomas playing on the floor, but it was real and it mattered, and she did not take it lightly. Jedediah watched this with a satisfaction he expressed mostly by making sure the firewood situation on Wednesday afternoons was particularly well managed. When she pointed this out to him, he said, "I just like to know you're warm when you're teaching," and she decided that was possibly the most characteristic thing he had ever said. Their daughter was born in March of 1879, which was a March that came in like something genuinely angry and left, in the way of March, like a lamb that had reconsidered. Her birth was faster than Thomas's had been, and Mrs. Bower was there again, brisk and competent, and this time less inclined to send Jedediah outside, because he had proved last time that he could behave himself. They named her Rose, which was Jedediah's suggestion, because she was born at the beginning of the month when the wild roses would come up along the creek in 8 weeks, and because Matilda thought it was a strong name in a simple package, which was the best kind. Rose was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, but a more observant one. She watched the world from very early with the steady, attentive gaze that her father used, and Matilda, looking at her daughter's face in those first weeks, would sometimes catch a look that she recognized immediately and felt something move through her that was too large for a single word. Thomas received his sister with an enthusiasm that was slightly too physical for the first week and required monitoring, but settled once he understood that Rose was a permanent feature of the household, into a proprietorial affection that expressed itself in standing next to her crib and reporting on her activities to whoever would listen. "She is looking," he would announce. "She looked at me." "That's because you're very interesting," Matilda told him. "Yes," Thomas agreed seriously. Jedediah watched his children with the same quiet, intense attention he gave to everything, and Matilda would catch him sometimes just looking at them. At Thomas plowing through the kitchen at top speed toward something only he could see, at Rose lying in her cradle watching the light on the ceiling, and his face in those moments was the most open she ever saw it, all the careful restraint gone, replaced by something simple and enormous. "You are a good father," she told him one evening when the children were both asleep, and they were sitting by the fire with the peculiar peace of parents in the quiet interval between children's bedtime and their own. "I don't always know what I'm doing," he said. "That's true of every parent," she said. "You seem to know what you're doing," he said. "I am pretending extremely well," she said. "There is a difference." He laughed. She loved his laugh. She had loved it since the first time she had heard the real version of it, 3 years ago in her kitchen over something she had said about mule temperament, and she still loved it now with a fullness that had only grown. The spring of 1879 brought more settlers to the territory, the land filling in around them. New families on new claims, and Cutter's Creek expanded again. A second general store and a proper hotel and a doctor's office, which was a development that the whole county greeted with relief because the nearest doctor before that had been in Pueblo, 40 miles south. The doctor was a woman, which caused some conversation. Her name was Dr. Adelaide Marsh, and she was 34 and had trained in Philadelphia and come to Colorado Territory because she had heard there was a need, and she had no patience for what Philadelphia thought a woman doctor should be doing instead. Matilda met her at the general store 2 weeks after her arrival, and they talked for 30 minutes in the middle of the road, while their respective horses waited without complaint. And by the end of it, they were as close to immediate friends as practical-minded women ever get, which is to say they had each recognized something in the other and agreed to pursue the acquaintance. Jedediah met Dr. Marsh at the Bridgers' dinner table that fall, where Clara had assembled what she called a civilized supper, but was in fact an extremely social occasion with 6 adults and several children, and he and Dr. Marsh talked about medicine and the war for 2 hours with the absorbed focus of people who had found an unexpected commonality, because Jedediah had seen enough field surgery in Virginia to know more about medicine than most men of his background, and Dr. Marsh had read enough about the field conditions of the war to know what that meant. Coming home from the Bridgers that night, with both children asleep in the wagon bed and the autumn stars enormous above them, Matilda sat beside Jedediah on the wagon seat and thought about how full the world had become in 5 years. How the empty plain around their homestead was not so empty anymore, how the people in it were real and known and linked to them by the ordinary ties of neighborliness and friendship and shared work. "I never thought I would still be here," she said suddenly. He looked at her sideways in the starlight. "Here in Colorado, here," she said. "When Robert died, I almost left. I was very close to leaving." He was quiet for a moment. "What stopped you?" he said. "Pride," she said honestly. "And then stubbornness. And then eventually it started to feel like mine." She paused. "And then you kept bringing me wood." She felt him still beside her for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the seat between them and held it in both of his, the way he had done the night he told her he loved her. And she thought about 3 years ago and everything since, and she thought you could not have planned this. You could not have looked at that gray March morning when she had stood at a new grave and been entirely alone and seen away from there to here, to a wagon seat under the Colorado stars with her husband's hands around hers and her children asleep behind her, and a life that was, in every way that mattered, entirely and beautifully real. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "So am I," she said. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that had always been between them, a conversation. The apple trees bore particularly well in 1879, and Matilda and Jedediah spent 3 days in late September picking and pressing and canning, with Thomas attempting to help and Rose watching from a blanket in the grass with the judicious air of someone observing quality control. They filled the cellar with preserves and cider and dried apple rings on strings that hung from the kitchen rafters and made the cabin smell, all winter, like something good. That Christmas, they had the Bridgers and Dr. Marsh and the Carroll family, Mr. Carroll having married a woman from Cutter's Creek that spring, and the cabin was full and warm and loud in the way of a house full of people who are glad to be together. Thomas at 3.5 was deeply invested in the Christmas proceedings, and Rose at 9 months was invested in putting whatever she could reach into her mouth, and Clara Bridger presided over the dinner table with the satisfaction of a woman in her element, and Tom Bridger told a story about a cattle drive that got more embellished with each telling, and Dr. Marsh and Jedediah argued about a medical article she had received from Philadelphia that he had read the previous week, and Matilda sat at one end of her own table and looked at all of it and felt the particular happiness of a woman who has built something and knows it. After everyone had gone home and the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet except for the fire, she and Jedediah sat together in the kitchen with the last of the apple cider, warm and spiced on the hearth, and she said, "What do you want for next year?" He thought about it seriously, which was how he thought about everything. "More cattle," he said. "Fix the roof on the east barn before spring. Get Thomas started on his letters." "Those are practical things," she said. "I meant, what do you want?" He looked at her. The firelight was in his eyes and his face was entirely open, the face she knew better than any face in the world, the one she had been watching since a March morning in 1874 when he had ridden up to her door with his hat in his hands and the most careful condolences she had ever heard. "This," he said simply. "Exactly this. All of it." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Me too." She reached across and took his hand and he held it and they sat together in the warm quiet of the kitchen while the fire burned and the Colorado night was deep and cold and clear outside, and the new year was 3 days away, and the woodpile against the east wall was stacked chest-high and solid, enough to last until March, enough to last through everything. It had all started with an axe in the dark before sunrise, with a man who had nothing to gain but had done it anyway, not for obligation but for something older and quieter than obligation, for the simple reason that there was a woman who needed wood and he wanted her to be warm. It had started with that and it had become this life and this family and this love that had grown the way good things grow, by steady tending over time, by the daily choice to show up and do the work and stay. Outside, the stars over Colorado burned with a cold, ancient light, indifferent and vast, and inside the cabin by the fire, Matilda Underwood, who had been Matilda Ramsey, who had once pressed her ear against a rough-hewn wall and wondered if she was imagining things, sat with her husband's hand in hers and knew, with the certainty of someone who had tested her own ground and found it solid, that she was not imagining anything. This was real, all of it. Every early morning and every shared silence and every piece of wood split and stacked, every conversation and every laugh and every night she had reached for him in the dark and found him there. Every apple from every tree they had replanted together. Every line she had read aloud while he listened. Every Thursday and every Friday and every day in between. Real and hers and good. Thomas made a sound in his sleep in the next room, some small dream proceeding, and Jedediah turned his head toward the sound with the automatic alertness of a parent, and then relaxed and looked back at Matilda, and she thought his eyes in the firelight were not quite gray and not quite blue, like a November sky that had decided, for tonight, to be warm. "Come to bed," she said. He stood up and offered her his hand, and she took it, and they banked the fire and checked the children. Thomas sprawled in his characteristic diagonal across his small bed. Rose curled compact and perfect in her crib, both of them breathing the deep, uncomplicated breath of children who are safe and warm and loved. They went to their own room and lay down in the dark, and the cold was far away outside, and the stars were doing what they always did, and the land was quiet under the snow. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And so was he. And they had been, she thought, in the process of getting here for a long time, through everything that had happened, from that gray March morning to this Christmas night. She thought just before she slept about what Clara had said, "Are you going to let him keep chopping wood for you indefinitely?" And she thought about how the answer in the end had been no. She had not let him keep doing it indefinitely. She had done something about it. They both had. But even now, even with 4 years of marriage and 2 children and a life built solid and real around them, there were mornings when she heard the sound before sunrise, when Jedediah had woken early with some thought or some restlessness and had gone out to the woodpile, the way a man does when he needs to move and be useful, and she would lie in the early dark and listen to the axe and feel, every single time, the same thing she had felt the first night she had understood what it was. Not obligation. Never that. Something much older and much more true and much more worth waiting for than she had known on a gray March morning in 1874, when she had stood at a new grave in the mud and told herself she was not going anywhere. She had not gone anywhere. She had stayed. And everything good in her life had come from that single stubborn act of staying, from pressing her feet into the Colorado soil and holding on, from opening her door on a cold November morning to find a woodpile that had not been there the day before, from listening for the sound of an axe in the dark and letting herself understand, when the time came, what it meant. She stayed. He came. And the rest, the long, beautiful, ordinary, magnificent rest of it was theirs.